Hello, at 1,000 subscribers, I will make a special series of stories for you. The cowboy's name was Clay Harlow, and he rode the desert the way a hawk rides a thermal, using what rose beneath him, and not asking why it rose at all. He'd left the last line camp before dawn, a tin cup clinking off the saddle horn, a pair of bedroll straps thwacking against his bay's flank. The horse was rangy, all tendon and sense, and he answered to Red even though he wasn't. Clay liked a horse that had learned to ignore what folks called it dot by noon. Heat lay over the Jornada like another sky. The land was a ledger of chalk and thorn and broken glass light. Mesquite kept its mean counsel, and the wind had teeth. Clay's canteen rode cool in a burlap sack, soaked and tied behind the saddle, sweating like a man in church. He rationed. It one mouthful held a while, then swallowed and saved the rest for the horse. Red flicked an ear and went on, steady as a metrome. It was the vultures that drew his eye first, 5 wobbling specks against the blister. Then a column of smoke, thin as a woman's hair. Clay rocked back in the saddle and let Red slow to a walk. He'd learned to read the desert's handwriting, the way tracks opened and closed, the way sound traveled or didn't. Smoke meant fire, and fire in this country meant trouble. He thumbed the leather keeper off his Winchester's hammer and let that small click settle him. He came on the wreck gradual, letting the desert tell him what had happened before the wreck shouted it. First the sour smell, fat and sweet, the stink of burned bacon and spilled coffee and canvas gone to black lace. Then the wheel tracks gouged deep and flurried, like a team spooked. The churn of hooves, too many to count without kneeling. Then brass scattered like dull cornel, lot of it, if in calibers, not all from the same gun. He swung down and tied Red to a greasewood bush, picked up a shell with 2 fingers, and turned it in the light. 44 Henry. Over yonder, a few .36 paper cartridges half scorched, and a piece of a tin of caps. Clay squatted, forearms on thighs, still as a hunter who has all afternoon got there had been a wagon army issue by the iron tires and the way. The tongue had been spliced, boxes busted open, flour on the ground like the ghost of snow, already clotted with blood and grit. A blue coat sleeve stuck out from under a charred tarp, the brass buttons blistered like blisters on a laborer's palm. The fire had burned hot and fast, made a black flour, and then starved. No coyotes yet. Too much smoke still in the air. Clay moved slow. The stillness here was a trap of a different kind, the way a place goes quiet when it has said too much. He looked for sign with his whole body, turning his head as if listening with his jaw. Spur marks in the dust, sharp as signatures. A heel with a star nailed into it Texan, or a man who wanted you to think so. A broken rawhide thong. A dark spray against a boulder where the color didn't belong. He made a circle wider than any. Man's impatience, and finally he came to the boulder itself, a humped thing like the knuckle of the earth. He heard them before he saw them. A whisper not meant for him, tight as a bowstring. Then the barely audible rasp of rawhide working against stone. Clay lifted the Winchester and stood to one side of the boulder's shadow. No words at first. Words can spook worse than a rattler when you don't share them. He leaned around and saw 3 figures pressed into the shade women, hands bound behind them, knees drawn up, faces streaked with ash and something older than ash. They were barefoot. One had a cut at the lip that had bled and dried and bled. Again, Clay's first thought wasn't noble. It was practical. Who had done this, and were they still near? He checked sky, ridge, and ground the way you check a deck for marked cards. Nothing moved but the heat and the tall, shimmering lie of it. He slid the Winchester back into the scabbard and showed his hands, fingers spread empty as the day he was born. "I'm coming," he said, not because they would understand the words, but because the tone matters. Keep still. Their eyes tracked him. Dark eyes with a clarity he'd seen in thirsty antelope and winter stars. No pleading, no trust either. Just an accounting. He went to one knee, took out his bowie, and saw the way they focused on the blade, the way breath hitched and steadied. Clay set the knife flat across his palm and raised his eyebrows, asking. The eldest, he thought she was eldest, by the way. The other two leaned toward her, without knowing it inclined her head once. He cut the first thong, clean through, then the second and third, each strand sticking to the blade with sap and sweat. Freed, the youngest rubbed her wrists with a furious little motion that did not belong to a child. The middle one flexed her hands and glanced beyond Clay into the killer bright day, calculating distances. The eldest lifted her chin and stared at Clay as if he had passed or failed a test, and it was not yet clear which. He stepped back, slid the knife home, and unstoppered. The canteen. Water, he said, and took a sip to show them how little he meant to take, how little a man could live on if he had to. He offered it to the eldest with both hands. She looked at him, at the canteen, at him again, and took it. The metal kissed her lip, and she took one measured swallow, then passed it without being told. Clay watched the ritual, the way a precious thing moved between them like a prayer bowl. When it came back, it was lighter by 3 sips and tumbled with that particular sound a canteen makes when the afternoon starts to lean. He let his breath out. We're going to move, he said, scanning the skyline. Shade ain't protection. Shade just means you can see what's coming when it comes. They didn't answer. The youngest pushed hair from her eyes with a hand that shook and then pretended it didn't. The middle one pressed at the cut on the eldest's lip with her thumb, briefly, cleanly, as if to say, there you are still you. Clay admired the economy of it. He'd never been good with talk either. At the wagon. The fire had died enough to get close. Clay kicked through the rubble careful as a churchman, looking for a saddle blanket, a tarp, anything useful. He found a scorched coffee grinder, still in its tin, a half-melted tin of lard, a mess of nails that would still be nails when the desert outlived them all. A cracked soldier's canteen, dry as a preacher's humor. A Bible with its edges burned to black lace, and a name written inside in a hand more careful than the life it was living. He folded a bit of the tarp and brought it back for the women to wrap their feet. The youngest refused, jaw tight. Clay didn't press it. He handed the torn canvas to the eldest, who tore it into 3 long strips with a neat, even strength and bound their feet herself. There were bodies. 2 men in sun-faded blue, one with his face turned to stone, one with no face left at all. Clay covered them with what tarp remained, because some things you do even when nobody knows you did them. There were drag marks, something someone hauled away. The marks went north and west, and then disappeared in the hardpan, where the wind had written on top of the writing. He could have followed them if a man wanted trouble he wasn't already carrying. He didn't. He brought Red closer and loosened the cinch so the horse could breathe deep, then retightened and checked his cinch knot with a tug that was more habit than need. He looped the lead rope around the boulder where the shade still held. The women watched him with that same bare interest, as if they were memorizing him the way a scout memorizes a crossing. How he moves, what he touches, where his eyes go when they go far away. Tracks say there were 12 at least, he said. Half to the horse because the horse didn't care if a man ran his mouth. Mixed guns, mixed boots, not soldiers. Not Apaches neither. Drifters, some, maybe Mex lads looking for an easy bit. Men who cut sign as well as I do, and worse than I have. He felt rather than heard the change in the air, the way the heat shifted and sound grew a skin. Coyotes came finally, ghosting. The edges with their heads low, eyes ambitious and uncertain. Clay shooed them off without much effort. Coyotes know a living man from a dying one, and they respect the difference. What he worried about was men. Men come back to pick through the wreck the way ants go back to sugar. He took his bedroll off the cantle and spread it in the narrow shade, motioning to the women to sit. They did, not because he said so, but because shade is shade. Clay set his, had brim to throw a slice of darkness across his eyes, and forced himself to be still. Being still is work, the kind that keeps you alive. The eldest sat straight against the stone, looking past him the way a person looks at the next hill, even when their feet hurt from the last one. The middle one watched the coyotes as if memorizing them too. The youngest slept in a hard, shallow way, waking every few minutes as if she were surfacing from a deep pool and not finding air where she left it. He took stock. 1 canteen, 2/3 full. 1 sack of beans, 1 of coffee. Biscuits gone to crumbs from 100 miles of Jones. He could pour the crumbs into bacon grease and call it supper. Ammunition as he had counted it last town, minus what he'd used to scare a timber rattler off a water hole. A spare canteen in his saddlebag, blessedly half full. He'd forgotten that until he put his hand to it and felt the slosh and wanted to laugh for no reason at all. The sun slipped inch by stingy inch toward a line of basalt teeth, and with it the world came back to edges and shape. Clay stood. "We move now," he said, tapping his chest and then pointing toward the low crease in the land where he knew. An arroyo ran, a dry river that sometimes remembered itself after a storm. He mined walking and sleeping in water. If you are courteous enough, hands can do a lot of talking. The eldest nodded once. The 3 of them stood in a single motion. It wasn't anything like a drill, and also was an accident. They went on foot. Clay led Red by the rein, the horse's breath a steady rumble in the hush. The land unrolled under them, silvered now, where the dying light caught each blade and thorn and made them look precious. A jackrabbit bolted and hooked left the way luck does. Clay scanned ridgelines, found them empty, and didn't let that soothe him. The tracks of the men who had done it lay like a sentence missing its verb, half washed by wind, but he felt them the way you feel a fever break. Those men were out there somewhere, maybe drunk now around a fire, telling themselves a story about the day. Men tended to narrate their own sins as if that absolved them. They reached the arroyo at twilight, when the heat gets its first doubt. The wash was choked with saltbush and tamarisk. Not much cover, but better than the open. There was a dry pool with cracked mud, like a map of a country nobody owned. Clay checked the cracks and found damp 2-finger joints down not water worth. The name, but promise. He walked a little farther and came on a place where the stone held a shallow, carved by years, and their water cupped in shadow like a secret. It wasn't much, but it was wet. He knelt, scooped a poundful, tasted the alkali sting, and decided even bad water is good when you are where they were. He motioned the women forward. They came silent, and he held the canteen back with a small shake of his head, directing them to the little shadowed cup instead. He'd learned the hard way that men die when they flood a dry gut too fast. They drank the right way, a mouthful held in the mouth like a jewel before letting it go to the throat. The youngest looked at him over the water with a quick, fierce gratitude that was already turning into something else. Not trust. Maybe not yet, but a ledger line written in his favor. He built a small fire that made more light than smoke. Small. Fires keep a man honest, and they don't advertise beyond the next bend. He took the coffee pot out of his saddlebags and set it with the casual reverence men give to things that have kept them whole. The smell lifted something in him and set it back down in a better place. He saw the women watching the ritual. The grounds measured by eye, the water poured by ear, the way he waited and didn't rush the boil. They recognized the ceremony of it because they had their own. He didn't ask names. Names belong to people, and people belong to themselves. He broke the biscuit crumbs into the lard and warmed them until they were edible, then passed the pan. They ate with that same economy, each bite an affair between teeth and need. Coyotes sat a little way off, bold with dusk, and Clay tossed them nothing. It is a bad bargain to feed witnesses. Night pressed in then, thick as felt. Stars came hard and close, and the sky showed its bones. Clay lay with his back to the embankment, hat over his eyes, Winchester close, and listened to the desert's night shift punch in, the click of beetles, the high wire song of a nightjar, the careless skitter that means a lizard, and the careful one that means a snake. The women slept in a row, the youngest in the middle now, without admitting it was a choice. The eldest didn't sleep at first. He could feel the wakefulness coming off her like heat. She sat with her knees drawn up, fingers lightly touching at the tips, and looked at the slice of sky the arroyo offered them. When she did sleep, it was not surrender so much as a bargain struck for an hour. Clay drifted on the thin raft of the soldier's rest, waking at each notch of the night as if a hand had shaken him. Once he heard something big on the rimmed ear, or a man. His throat went paper dry, and then it passed, whatever it was, like a thought you decide not to have. Toward morning, the air turned edge-cool, and the foxfire of dawn began, that brief mercy between the burnings. He fed the fire a last sliver of twig, and poured grounds into a handful of coarse cloth, made a poor man's filter, and felt like a rich man when he drank. He poured 3 more tin cups, and set them where the smoke would find them. When they woke, the women drank, and the youngest smiled for the first time. It made her look briefly like the child she had been already too. Long ago. A middle one touched her own chest and said a name he didn't catch, a swift river syllable. Clay nodded, memorizing the sound, but he didn't repeat it. The eldest watched him with the same analytic calm, as if she were adding him up. Would keep doing so until the sum stopped changing. He pointed down the wash. "We'll head south," he said, tapping his chest again, then the horizon, then drawing a zigzag with his finger to mean the way a man travels when he hopes not to be seen. "There's a rock shelf there, and wind caves. Good to lay up in, if the sun decides to be a judge." The eldest looked where he pointed, and then past it, further than a man's eye could claim. She nodded once and stood. It wasn't assent in the way folks think of it. It was a temporary treaty with the morning. "We will go that way until we don't." They moved out with the sun low, and the day only thinking about being cruel. Clay walked ahead, counting steps like a man measures out rope. Red followed, ears pricked, investing his trust the only place a horse can forward. Behind came the 3 women, foot-wrapped and spare, their shadows long and sure on the hardpan. The desert made a single sound then, the soft silk of moving bodies. On the rim above them, a scatter of pebbles slid, very small. Clay didn't look up right away. He let his hand fall to the Winchester, as if scratching an itch. When he glanced sideways, he saw it without turning his head, the crisp crescent of a horseshoe, in undisturbed dust a day old at most, and a cigarette butt with the paper burned back to a wet black smear. Men had been here recently, the kind who smoke when they think the world owes them smoke. Clay kept walking. Later, when they reached the wind caves, when shade became architecture, and the sun's blade slid past them, he would decide what to do about that sign, whether to circle back and rub the trail from itself, whether to lay still and let danger walk past, whether to take the fight to where it already was. For now, he took them forward, into a day that would be unforgiving, and a night that would be theirs if they earned it. He had not asked for company. The desert doesn't ask for water. It takes it when it gets it. But the compass inside him, sprung and wandering since the war, ticked once and steadied a hair. There were 3 more heartbeats traveling his trail now. That changes a man's arithmetic. Before the sun cleared the ridge, he looked back just once, and the eldest met his glance and did not look away. Something passed between them, and that wasn't language and wasn't silence. It was consent. To keep walking together 1 more hour. In this country, an hour can be a kind of eternity. They went on. The land lifted in slow, old swells, and the day gathered weight. The promise of trouble rode out there somewhere, on a different ridge, in a different man's idea of himself. It would arrive in its own chapter. This one belonged to the drifter and the desert, to 3 women in the hard shade of his shadow, to the long breath you take before a gunshot you can't yet hear. Clay Harlow had always kept his fires small. A cowboy learns that in a land where the dark belongs more to enemies than to friends. Flames no higher than his boot heel, built tight from mesquite twigs, just enough heat to boil coffee and draw the chill out of his bones. But that night, in the dry arroyo where they had settled, the fire seemed to draw a circle larger than its light, a circle that held him, and the 3 women who had drifted into his fate like leaves caught in the same eddy. The sky was star-bitten and endless. Coyotes yipped somewhere on the far rim, voices carrying through the stillness like laughter that wasn't meant for men. Clay listened to the sound and let it fade. He had fought too many battles to fear the scavengers of the desert. It was men he worried about, the kind who made smoke and left bodies behind. The women sat across the fire from him, shadows swallowing their shoulders, eyes glinting whenever a flame bent toward them. They were tired, though they hid it with the quiet dignity of people who had survived much worse. Clay had given them food, beans stewed in his dented pot, crumbled biscuits softened with lard. They had eaten slowly, sharing in silence, as though the fire itself demanded reverence. When the youngest Tala, though he did not yet know her name, finished, she rubbed the tin plate clean with a scrap of burned bread, then passed it back. To him. Her face caught the light for a moment, and Clay saw she was younger than he had thought. No more than 17 summers, perhaps. The middle sister, Kaya, watched him steadily, lips pressed into a line, as if testing him for weakness. But it was the eldest, Ayana, who finally broke the silence. "You fight for us," she said in careful English. Her voice was low, weighted with both caution and pride. "Why?" Clay had expected silence, maybe a few words in Apache he couldn't follow, but not that. He looked at her across the fire, one hand cupped around his tin mug, and gave the only answer he could think of. "'Cause I rode by and saw wrong," he said. "And I don't ride past wrong when it stares me in the face." The words sounded thin to him, smaller than the weight of what he felt. He wasn't a man given to speeches. He preferred the plain truth of action. But the women studied him with the intensity of gamblers watching a man lay down his hand. Ayana tilted her head. "Many men ride past wrong," she said. "They do." "Not stop," Clay shrugged. "Then I ain't one of them." The fire cracked. A faint breeze slid through the arroyo, carrying the smell of dust and tamarisk. Clay poured coffee into 3 cups, thick and black as tar. He slid one across the sand toward Ayana, and another toward Kaya. Tala reached eagerly for hers, both hands around the warm tin, her eyes brightening as though she had never tasted such a thing before. They drank in silence a while, the fire's breath rising and falling between them. Then Ayana spoke again. "Our people are gone," she said. The words came slow, each one placed carefully, like stones across a stream. "Raiders came in night, men with rifles. They kill some. They take some. We left behind." She tapped her chest, then pointed to Kaya and Tala. "No family, no." Clay felt the truth of it settle in his gut like a lead weight. He had seen it too many times, The wreckage left when greed and hunger turned men savage. You got no kin at all? He asked. Ayana shook her head. No here. Not safe. No home. Her eyes fixed on his, and in them he saw no begging, only a fierce resolve. Take us with you. Clay sat back. The words struck harder than any bullet. He had ridden alone so long that company felt like a foreign land. Companionship meant responsibility, and responsibility was the heaviest burden of all. A man on. His own could vanish into the horizon whenever trouble came. A man with others depending on him. That was a different trail entirely. You don't know me, he said slowly. Don't know where I'm headed. Might be I'm ridden nowhere at all. Ayana did not look away. Then we go nowhere with you. Kaya spoke for the first time, her English rougher, but her meaning sharp. Better to follow one man than to be hunted by many. You have gun, you fight, we obey. Clay almost laughed at the word. Obey. He'd never sought obedience. Not from horses, not from men, and certainly not from women. Respect, maybe. Trust, if it came hard-earned. But obedience was a word that left a sour taste. Still, the way Kaya said it was not servile. It was survival, pure and stripped bare. You don't owe me nothing, Clay said, voice firm. You're free. I cut your bonds. Tala looked up then, her voice softer than the others, but clear as a bell. Free to die alone, she said. Words echoed in the arroyo, carried by the night wind. Clay swallowed, staring into the fire. He thought of the long years behind him, the battles, the cattle drives, the gambling dens, the friends buried shallow in prairie dirt. He thought of the emptiness of riding into town after town with no one waiting, no one even caring if he returned. The three women were not pleading. They were simply offering a truth. Alone, they would perish. Together, they might endure. And, for reasons he could not name, the thought of leaving them behind hollowed him more than the thought of danger ahead. He stirred the embers with a stick. Sparks leapt, drifted upward, and vanished into the stars. You sure about this? He asked. Finally, his voice a rough whisper. Ayana nodded once, firm as a brand. Kaya echoed the gesture, eyes unblinking. Tala only whispered, yes, with a faint tremor, but it carried more weight than a shout. Clay sighed, took off his hat, and ran a hand through his sweat-matted hair. All right, he said. You ride with me. But listen close we live. By my trail rules. We keep low, move quiet, and never waste food, water, or powder. You do that, we'll stand a chance. The women exchanged glances. Then all three nodded. Something shifted in the air then, subtle as the desert breeze. Clay felt it not obedience, not submission, but a bond forming like rawhide drying in the sun, tough and unyielding. They had thrown their lot in with him, and in turn, he had chosen not to walk alone. The fire burned lower. Clay lay back with his hat over his eyes, Winchester within arm's reach. Across the flames, the sisters curled together under the rough canvas he had given them. For the first time in a long while, he did not feel like a ghost drifting through a hollow land. Sleep came slow, but it came with a strange kind of peace. And as the coyotes sang their midnight song, Clay Harlow knew that tomorrow he would not be riding into the horizon by himself. The desert had dealt him a hand, and for once, he was willing to play it. The desert does not care who claims it. That truth lived in Clay Harlow's bones the way marrow lives in the hollow of a man's legs. He had ridden long enough to know the Jornada del Muerto was no more forgiving to cowboys than to Apaches. Soldiers or drifters. The sun stripped every man the same, and the wind erased every track if given time enough. But there were men in the world who did not take the hint. Clay saw the riders at dawn, long before they saw him. He had risen early. as he always did, to scout the ridgeline. The three sisters still slept in the half-light, curled together like fawns. Red, his horse, dozed with one hind hoof cocked, a picture of false ease. Clay squatted in the dust and studied the horizon through the blue haze of morning dust plume. 8, maybe 9 horses. The light caught on iron and brass rifle barrels, belt buckles, the clatter of gear carried on the wind. Their gait was too steady for outlaws drunk from the night before. These were working men, hard men. The kind who lived by what they could take. Clay spat into the dust and let it soak dark. Trouble had found them quicker than he'd hoped. Returned to the arroyo and touched Ayana's shoulder. Her eyes snapped open at once, clear and sharp. She woke her sisters without a sound. The three of them moved like deer, who had learned hunters' ways, quick but quiet, hearts in their throats but feet steady. Riders, Clay said. He spoke low, clipped, the way a man does when time runs thin. 8, maybe 9. They'll be here inside an hour. Kaya's mouth tightened. Tala shivered, then bit her lip hard to stop it. Ayana nodded, her face unreadable. Clay loaded the Winchester, thumbed each cartridge with care, then checked the Colt at his hip. Ammunition was life, and he counted it like a banker counts gold. He had 26 rounds for the Winchester, 12 for the Colt, and a knife that had saved his skin more than once. Against 9 men, it was a poor ledger. Still, he reckoned he'd seen worse odds. He led the sisters up a side cut in the arroyo, where boulders tumbled like dice and offered cover. Stay low, he told them. Don't show yourselves unless I tell you, and whatever happens, don't run. You run, they'll chase. Ayana met his gaze. We stay, she said simply. Clay gave her a curt nod. He didn't have the breath for gratitude. By the time the riders appeared, the sun was full on the land, turning every rock into a blade of light. They came in a loose file, faces half hidden under slouch hats and brims. Dust and sweat streaked their clothes, but their guns gleamed like promises. The leader rode at the front, a tall man with a scar dragging across his cheek and down into his beard. He carried a shotgun laid casual across the saddle horn, as though it were an extension of his arm. His horse was a bay, almost as rangy as Red, and his eyes had the squint of a man too long in the sun and too long without conscience. Morning, he called, voice rough as gravel. Mighty unfriendly country to be wandering alone, cowboy. Saw your fire smoke last night. Clay stood in the open, Winchester cradled but ready. I ain't alone, he said evenly. The scarred man grinned, showing teeth gone to rot. That so? Then you got something we want. 3 of them, if my boys counted right. Hand them over, and maybe you ride away with your hide still on. The others laughed, spitting into the dust, eager for cruelty. Clay's jaw hardened. He felt the women's presence behind him, like 3 silent oaths pressed against his back. He shifted the Winchester into the crook of his shoulder. They're with me, he said. His voice was calm, but steel lay under every word. You'll ride on, Scarface chuckled low. Hear that, boys? He thinks he's John Damn Houston. Well, let's teach him how the desert sorts fools. The first shot cracked before the last word left his mouth. A puff of dust leapt at Clay's boots-warning fire. Then the canyon exploded. Clay dropped to one knee and fired. The Winchester kicked against his shoulder, the echo hammering down the arroyo walls. One rider pitched sideways, clutching at his chest, his horse screaming as it bolted. Clay worked the lever, smooth as a dance he'd done all his life, and fired again. Another man toppled, his rifle spinning from his grip. The scavengers scattered, firing wild. Bullets sparked off rock and whined overhead. Clay hugged the boulders, firing measured shots, never wasting powder behind him. Kaya dragged Tala into a hollow, shielding her with her own body. Ayanna crouched low, eyes sharp, her hand gripping a stone as if it were a weapon. They obeyed his orders, but their fear was a live thing in the air, pounding against his ears like another heartbeat. Scarface spurred forward, shotgun roaring. Pebbles exploded where Clay's head had been a second earlier. Clay rolled, came up firing. His bullet caught Scarface's horse in the shoulder. The animal screamed, stumbled, and fell, pitching its rider hard into the dust. Scarface rose, face twisted with rage, shotgun swinging up. Clay's Colt was already in his hand. 2 shots. Quick, sure. Scarface fell back, the desert claiming him without ceremony. The others broke. Raiders are wolves until the lead wolf falls. Then they are. Curs looking for escape. They spurred away, dust rising behind them. Curses trailing on the wind. Clay stood in the ringing silence, chest heaving, smoke curling from his Colt. 2 bodies lay cooling in the dust. The rest were specks fading toward the horizon. Slowly, he holstered the pistol and turned. The sisters emerged from the rocks, moving like shadows shaken loose from stone. Tala clutched Kaya's arm, wide-eyed but unhurt. Ayanna stepped forward, her face grave, and pressed a bundle of herbs from a pouch into Clay's hand. "You bleed," she said. Clay looked down. A furrow across his forearm, nothing deep but hot with pain. He had not even felt it in the fight. He nodded, letting her bind it. Her touch was sure, practiced. "You saved us," Kaya said. Her voice trembled but held. Clay shook his head. "Saved myself too. Don't mistake it." But even as he spoke, he knew the truth was more tangled. He could have ridden on. He could have let fate take them the way it had taken so many. Yet he had stood, and they had stood with him, not with bullets, but with presence, with trust. At night, as they camped far from the blood-stained arroyo, Clay lay awake staring at the stars. The sisters whispered together in their own tongue, voices soft and flowing like water over stone. He caught a word now and then, his name, perhaps, or the Apache word for protector. Clay closed his eyes. He had not asked for them, nor for him. But blood had been spilled, and blood was a binding thing. In the desert, debts are written not on paper, but in the flesh and memory of those who survive. The sisters had no kin left, and Clay, though he wouldn't admit it even to himself, had just found some. The fight in the arroyo changed something in all of them. Not in an instant, not with any declaration, but the way a seed splits underground and pushes up green without a sound. The sisters no longer looked at Clay Harlow as a man who had simply cut their bonds. Now they looked at him as though he had stepped into the shape of something larger, a shield, a guide, perhaps even a piece of fate. And Clay, though he kept his jaw tight and his eyes on the horizon, felt the weight of that recognition like a new notch on his soul. Trails of dust and days of silence, they traveled southward, where the mesas rose like the backs of sleeping giants. Clay rode ahead on red, scanning the land, always listening for the clatter of hooves that didn't belong. The sisters walked most days, sometimes riding bareback on the spare Mustang when the sun grew murderous. The desert tested them. Wind scoured their skin raw. The sun baked their lips into cracked leather. Nights fell cold enough that breath frosted in the starlight. But the sisters endured. Kaya learned to knot a blanket into a saddle pad. Tala learned to find water hidden under willow roots. And Ayanna, who seemed to know the land's moods, could smell rain days before it broke. They spoke little at first. Clay was a man of silence, and the sisters matched it. Each word carried like an arrow spent only when it mattered. But in the long hush of the trail, habits formed. Clay would whistle low while rolling his cigarettes, and Tala would hum a tune that was not a tune, just a string of rising notes like a bird testing its wings. Kaya, skeptical and sharp-eyed, asked him questions about his rifle, about the war, about the strange world of towns where men drank themselves blind. And Ayana, she listened more than she spoke, but when she did, it was like a stone dropped in still water, rippling far. "Why do you ride alone?" she asked one night by. The fire-dot Clay shrugged. "Easier that way. A man don't answer to no one. A man don't have to grieve when he leaves." "Easier is not always better," Ayana said. She looked at him with those eyes that seemed to see behind his ribs. "Sometimes the hardest path is the only one worth walking." Clay had no answer. To that, he poured more coffee and let the fire do the talking. Hard lessons it wasn't enough to keep them close. Clay knew they needed to know how to survive if he fell. So he taught. He showed Tala how to listen for the hollow echo in a dry wash that meant water lay just beneath. He made Kaya practice mounting and dismounting until she could swing onto the Mustang with one quick motion. He drilled them in silence how to walk across shale without turning it into a drum, how to keep low against the sky when crossing open ground. Ayana watched everything, memorizing as though each skill were another prayer. One morning, when Clay was cleaning his Colt, she surprised him by saying, "Teach me." He frowned. "A gun ain't no charm. You draw it, you'd better mean it." "I mean it," she said simply. So he taught her, slowly, carefully. Her hands were steady, her eye keen. The first time she fired, the sound cracked across the canyon and birds wheeled from the cliffs. She didn't flinch. She only nodded, as though confirming something she already knew. That night, Clay rolled into his blanket and stared at the stars long after the fire died. He thought about what it meant to arm all of them with knowledge of a world that had taken so much. It felt like passing a torch and wondering if it would burn or light the way. The bonds of the trail weeks stretched. They crossed a land of red stone cathedrals and dry rivers that carved scars into the earth. Once they found the tracks of soldiers' iron-rimmed wheels, mule prints, hobnailed boots. Clay led them far around, knowing the army would not ask who they were before deciding what they were worth. Another time, they rode into a thunderstorm that split the sky with silver fire. Rain came down in sheets, turning the desert into a roaring sea of mud and sudden torrents. Tala laughed, head thrown back, as though the storm was a gift. Kaya cursed in Apache at the cold, though her eyes shone with the wild thrill of it. Ayana stood in the downpour unmoving, arms raised, as if greeting something sacred. Clay watched them through the veil of rain and felt a strange warmth inside him, stronger even than the whiskey he sometimes dreamed of. He had seen soldiers break under storms, cattle drown in flash floods, towns wash away. Yet these three women, who had lost more than he dared imagine, embraced the storm as if it were life itself. That night, huddled under a cliff while the rain hammered, Ayana said, "You think we follow you, but you follow us too." Clay met her eyes, the firelight flickering in them. He didn't answer, but deep inside, he knew she was right. Toward the horizon by the time spring hinted at the edges of the desert, they were no longer four strangers clinging to survival. They were a band, a family forged not by blood, but by fire and dust. Kaya laughed more freely now, though she never lost her sharp tongue. Tala grew stronger, her steps lighter, her eyes curious about everything Clay showed her. And Ayana, she became a quiet anchor, guiding them not with orders, but with a calm certainty that made even Clay trust his own trail more. One evening, as the sun sank in a blaze of crimson, Clay sat apart from the fire, oiling his rifle. Ayana came and knelt beside him. "You saved us," she said softly. Clay shook his head. "You saved me right back." "Might not see it that way, but it's true." She studied him a long moment, then smiled just the faintest curve of her lips. Then we are even. Clay looked out at the horizon, endless and wild, and felt something he hadn't in years. Belonging, not to a place, not to a town or a cause, but to the souls who rode beside him. The trail ahead was still uncertain. Enemies might rise again. Hunger and thirst would always stalk them, and the desert would never stop testing their will. But he no longer feared the emptiness of the road. For the first time in a long drifting life, Clay Harlow was not riding alone. The cowboy tightened the cinch on Red, adjusted his hat against the lowering sun, and rode forward. Behind him came 3 Apache women who had once begged him to take them, to let them obey forever. But now they rode not as followers, nor as shadows, but as companions, equal riders on the long road toward whatever horizon waited. The desert, for once, did not feel empty. It felt like the beginning of a story still being written.